The post office scandal led to 900 wrongful convictions and is called the worst miscarriage of justice in British history. And all of this was because post office management didn't know how to deal with glitchy software. In this episode, you will learn how not to repeat their mistakes. Welcome to the Tech for Non-Techies podcast. I'm your host, tech entrepreneur, executive coach, and Chicago Booth MBA, Sophia Matveeva. My aim here is to help you have a great career in the digital age. In a time when even your coffee shop has an app, you simply have to speak tech. On this podcast, I share core technology concepts, help you relate them to business outcomes, and most importantly, share practical advice on what you can do to become a digital leader today. If you want to have a great career in the digital age, this podcast is for you. Hello, smart people. How are you today? Last week, I was doing jury duty in London, and I was a juror on a criminal case that honestly left me emotionally drained. And I think that is a good thing, because when sad things happen, I want to feel sad because I'm not a psychopath. And I think there's a lot of toxic positivity around these days, which basically negates the human experience. Because when there is a miscarriage of justice, for example, as a society, we do not want to brush it under the carpet. We want to do what we can to correct it and to learn from it. And this is why in today's episode, I want to share what we can learn from the post office scandal, which has been called the biggest miscarriage of justice in UK history. And it started because senior people didn't know what to do about a software glitch. Before we get to the lessons learned, here is a quick recap of what actually happened. The British post office scandal arose from faulty software called Horizon, and Horizon was provided by a company called Fujitsu. And this software wrongly recorded shortfalls in the account of thousands of sub-postmasters. And this means that sub-postmasters, who are also known as postmasters, they're basically the people who are in charge of the post office. And they had to use this software, this Horizon software, as part of their work. So it was the software that you had to use if you're a sub-postmaster. And this software wrongly calculated how much money they made in their post office. So, for example, let's say that a postmaster made £1,000 in a week from, selling stamps, sending packages, and so on. So the postmaster would report that £1,000 made, and then they would take that £1,000 and send the money to the central head office. And a lot of that money was in cash. But if the software recorded that that particular post office actually made £2,000, but in fact, that post office only made £1,000 and the postmaster only actually had £1,000, then this poor postmaster had the legal obligation to give the central head office £2,000. So basically, they would need to find £1,000 from somewhere themselves. And if they couldn't, or if they didn't, then they were legally a thief. And whatever the software reported was basically used as evidence. And this is really dangerous ground, right? Because essentially the software was a false witness. And this false witness, this faulty software, it could not be relied on in court. But the justice system did not know that. And between 1999 and 2015, over 900 sub-postmasters were convicted of theft, fraud, and false accounting based on this faulty software. Other sub-postmasters were prosecuted but not convicted. So it's not just that those 900 people suffered. There were lots of other people who were forced to cover Horizon shortfalls with their own money. And sometimes this was literally in the tens of thousands of pounds. And I know that lots of listeners are in the US. I don't know exactly what the exchange rate was, but basically the pound is valued at higher than the dollar. So if it was like £10,000, it would be like, $15,000. So these postmasters often just didn't have that money, but their employer was literally extorting them. So the employer, the post office management, was saying either sell your house and hand over all of the money from selling your house or go to jail. And this is why learning how software is made is not just for people leading digital transformation or working in tech companies. We as a society now depend on software. And if we don't know anything about it, this is what we end up with. The court cases, criminal convictions, imprisonment, loss of livelihood, and also the huge debts and bankruptcies ruined lives. And they ruined people's health and led to at least 4 suicides. And I think this scandal has made many people in the UK really upset about this because we all go to the post office. I'm sure that even David Beckham, when he's in the UK, goes to the post office. We interact with the postmasters when we need to post packages or to buy stamps. And the thought that people who serve our neighborhoods were silently suffering like this for years is really making people very angry. And I think, honestly, this is justified anger. And although many sub-postmasters had reported problems with the new software, the post office, which was then led by a CEO called Paula Venables, the post office insisted that Horizon was robust, and the post office failed to disclose that they had any doubt about the fact that actually the software might be a bit faulty. So they basically continued prosecuting people and securing convictions whilst knowing that it was possible that the software was a false witness. In 2009, Computer Weekly broke the story about problems with Horizon, and then a gentleman called Alan Bates, who was a sub-postmaster, he launched a campaign organization called Justice for Sub-Postmasters Alliance. And this alliance has been fighting to overturn convictions, and Alan Bates really is a hero. But even in the first quarter of 2024, only 100 of the 900 convictions have been overturned, and not all of the victims have received compensation, and also nobody from post office management has faced any real punishment in the justice system. But they are now the most hated people in the country. Obviously, there is a lot more detail to this scandal, which we don't have the time to go into here, but there is a docu-series that came out this year called Mr. Bates versus the Post Office, and it is absolutely brilliant. It's really, really good storytelling, and I binge watched it and I wept. And you can watch it with people who don't know anything about technology or even business because it is a story about humans. And now, what can we learn from this disaster? Well, the first and most important lesson is that if you are in any position of power, then you have to educate yourself about how software is made. You don't have to go very deep. You don't need to learn to code, but you do need to learn the basic concepts and know how to ask the right questions. Paula Venables was the CEO of the post office, and she headed an organization that extorted fortunes out of working class people for years. From what we can tell, she believed that the software was like Fort Knox, perfect and infallible. So basically, even if we are super generous about this leader's character, what we see is that she had a basic lack of education. In the digital age, this is the equivalent of being illiterate. Do not be an illiterate leader. If a large proportion of your organization depends on software tools, you have to know something about software. This does not apply to every type of business. So if you run a restaurant, so you literally run one restaurant, not a chain. If you run one restaurant and you're using booking software to enable diners to book tables, then you know what? You don't really need to know about software innovation. You're probably too busy actually running a kitchen. But if you are in a responsible position in a company where revenue, supply chain, or any kind of important process depends on software, you have to learn something about it. It is your fiduciary responsibility, especially if there's also a legal aspect like there was in the post office. Paula Venables should have educated herself. But also, what about the people who appointed her? What about the board or the executive leadership or their advisors? It seems that the people at the highest echelons of one of the UK's largest organizations just decided to stay firmly in the 20th century. And if you're an investor, if you're a board member, or if you're a strategic advisor like a lawyer or a banker, you have a responsibility to nudge the executive team that you're working with to educate themselves. Otherwise, you run the risk of being close to another post office scandal. Because all of the people who advised the post office executive team back then, when this actual miscarriage of justice was taking place, all of those people are now implicated, and some of them are now villains in a popular TV series, and many of them still live in London. And literally, you can Google who they are. Honestly, I don't feel sorry for any of those people because I do think that they should have known better. This is a really clear example of people basically not educating themselves enough for the digital age and kind of resting on their laurels and assuming that, oh, I went to law school, maybe I went to business school. I reached this executive position because I'm really successful and I'm really smart. I don't need to learn anymore. Well, clearly this is wrong. Digital transformation is a fairly recent phenomenon. It is probably something that, people who are in positions of power today were not trained in. So you have to take that training into your own hands. The second lesson out of this awful scandal is that technology often has bugs. And that means that it is relatively normal for software to have issues. And these issues usually get fixed pretty quickly, but it is a fact that problematic software does get released to customers. It's not great, but it happens. Look at the OpenAI issues back in February this year. So literally about a month before this podcast episode comes out. The issue with OpenAI was that you could ask it for pictures of founding fathers of the US, and it generated pictures of Black founding fathers, which was obviously not the case. So this basically is just a software glitch. The software was not ready, it wasn't properly trained, and yet it was released to the public. And OpenAI is backed by Microsoft. It's not two people in a garage. And this is not a great look for Satya Nadella, but I want you to see that even Microsoft, a hugely successful and established company that employs the best engineers and has more money than God, sometimes releases buggy software. So the lesson here is that if something looks wrong, it probably is. Don't let software companies gaslight you into thinking that you don't know what's going on. If the post office management had just been aware of the fact that buggy software is a thing, then maybe they would have listened to postmasters earlier on. Maybe they wouldn't have actually used software data as evidence that basically you couldn't really argue against. And maybe those 4 people who committed suicide would still be alive, living wonderful, happy lives. The third lesson from the post office scandal is about how large organizations buy software. And this is also important for tech founders listening to this. So even if you are not leading a Fortune 100 company, listen to this lesson because you will often hire outsourced developers to make your products, and your software will be custom made for you. And this is basically what a large organization does too. So in the post office case, Fujitsu made custom software for the post office called Horizon, as we already discussed. And apparently the post office had no access to design documentation, and also the software itself was a black box. And if this sounds a bit jargony, I'll explain what this means. When software gets made, like when an app is made on your phone, there will be a team of designers who create what the app looks like and how it works, like what happens when you swipe right, how the screens follow each other, and so on. And all software companies will have these designs documented, kind of like a massive map. So you literally have drawings of screens and a map showing how they're all interconnected. If you are paying for somebody to make it for you, then you need this map, not just the outcome. And it's the same with the actual code. Code is written down, and there's also something called a README file, which is a description of all the technology tools used to build a product. You must expect access to this. If you are paying for something to be made for you, it is normal for you to expect to see how it is made. It is normal for you to expect that documentation because literally this is what you're paying for. And finally, here is the last lesson. From what I understand, the post office ran the tender process for this software contract, and back then several companies made the bid for the work. And so this would have been in the late 90s. And at the time, Fujitsu's bid was the cheapest. The lesson here is that you get what you pay for. And this is the case for government contracts, and if you just want to make a new app for your business. You could go on Upwork and you could find the cheapest person and you could hope for the best. But if the software is something that actually matters to you, something that's mission critical, do not go for the cheapest, go for the best. The cheapest and the best are usually mutually exclusive. And when I was watching Mr. Bates versus the Post Office, I did have the thought that if this podcast had been around back then and if Paula Venables had listened to it, she would not be one of the most hated people in Great Britain today. Because today, every large organization is a tech company in some way. So what you're learning here is going to pay off no matter what you're doing. So, positive note, well done for educating yourselves by listening to this podcast and for updating your skill set for the digital age. And the best way to make this knowledge really sink in is by taking one of the Tech for Non-Techies courses. We have a great track record of creating super engaging corporate trainings that people love. So if you like what you're learning here, let's talk about how we can tailor it for wherever you work. And also, I have some good news. I have seen research that says that learning and development budgets are on the rise this year. So it is really likely that your employer will pay you to learn from me. Won't that be fabulous? So book a consultation call in the show notes and we will tell you about our trainings and how the corporate reimbursement process usually works. So we will lead you through that. And on that note, have a wonderful day, and I shall be back in your delightful smart ears next week. Ciao.